Welcome back to another session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books. In this session, we'll take our last look at Charles Dickens, the man many people believe to be the greatest English writer of all time. We've already explored two of Dickens' masterpieces, David Copperfield, the story of an orphaned boy who faces many hardships on his road to eventual happiness and success, and A Tale of Two Cities, the stirring account of innocent people whose lives are caught up in the tumultuous events of the French Revolution. Now we're going to consider the novel that was perhaps Dickens' last great work, written 2 years after A Tale of Two Cities, in 1860. It's called Great Expectations, and although Dickens continued to write after this book and up until his death 10 years later, none of his later writings achieved the same popularity and acclaim. In writing Great Expectations, Dickens returned to many themes and styles that characterized his earlier works and from which he'd temporarily departed in A Tale of Two Cities. In fact, this novel bears a strong resemblance to David Copperfield in both story and themes. They're the only two books Dickens wrote in the first person, from the point of view of the hero. In both stories, the narrator is a mature adult, looking back on his life and particularly his childhood. In addition, the boys in both books are orphans, outcast from society, subject to the whims, kind or cruel, of those around them. And like most of his novels, A Tale of Two Cities being a notable exception, Great Expectations is a lengthy piece of work, with an intricate, complex plot and dozens of characters whose lives interweave in a complicated series of events and coincidences. But what distinguishes this book from his earlier works, among other things, is that by the time Dickens wrote it, he was more mature himself, and perhaps even more cynical. He'd entered the last season of his life, and with that season came a new kind of gentleness and wisdom, and a certain skepticism. The result is that the hero of Great Expectations, whose name is Pip, is unlike previous Dickens heroes. He's more ambiguous, has more dimensions, and undergoes more internal changes than, say, his predecessor, David Copperfield. Pip is neither good nor bad. There are times when we like him, and times we dislike him, and Dickens spends as much time on Pip's weaknesses as on his strengths, if not more. In that sense, Pip isn't a traditional hero, but in that sense, Pip is perhaps more real and more reflective of the virtues and flaws which coexist in all of us. Great Expectations is a landmark in Dickens' career because it's his most psychological book, the first book in which he was more focused on the internal workings of his characters than on plot. The motivations of the characters are far more complex and sophisticated, and many of his characters, not just the hero, experience an inner transformation. By the end of the book, they have changed. They've grown emotionally and spiritually from their sufferings. The style of the first-person narrative seems almost essential when writing a story of this kind, which explores the inner development of a character. By this device, we're able to know Pip intimately, from his first word to his last. We're deeply involved in his thoughts, emotions, and responses to the events and people which fill his life. The story begins at Pip's childhood home in the country, where he lives a simple life with his sister and brother-in-law, who's a blacksmith. But through his exposure to a wealthy woman and her proud, beautiful daughter, he begins to desire more in life. He craves the life of a gentleman, and all the trapping of that life: money, status, fine clothes, refined manners, and a formal education. When he suddenly comes into a great expectation, a term for an inheritance or endowment, he's able to pursue these dreams, and in doing so, he turns his back on the kind, simple people who have given him love and devotion. In short, Pip becomes a snob, an ambitious snob. And although he eventually comes to see the error of his ways, he must first suffer many painful experiences and disappointments that shake the very foundations of his beliefs and values. There are many themes in Great Expectations that are typical of Dickens' works: orphans, neglect and abuse of children, crime and law, prisons, class consciousness, to name a few. And there are some new themes, or at least themes Dickens develops far more than in previous works. One of those themes is property. Another is guilt. The acquiring of property, protecting and cleaving to one's property, the use of property to attain status or power, and the corrupting influence of property are themes played over and over in the book, and they involve most of the main characters. On a more psychological level, Dickens is particularly involved with exploring guilt in this story. The sources of guilt, the relationship between guilt and pride, and how guilt affects behavior and attitude. As you listen to the story of Great Expectations, it might broaden your perspective to consider these themes, property and guilt, and how they're related to plot and character development. Let's begin then with an introduction to the major characters. Although there are almost 30 characters who play significant roles in the story, we'll concentrate on only the most important of those. They are Pip, the narrator and hero of the story. He's an adult looking back on his boyhood and young adulthood. Thus, we're privy to the views of both the older and wiser Pip and the young, impressionable Pip. Pip's an orphan being raised by his severe sister and her loving husband, Joe. A good assessment of Pip is offered by another character who describes him as a good fellow with impetuosity and hesitation, boldness and diffidence, action and dreaming curiously mixed in him. Joe, the husband of Pip's sister. Joe's a blacksmith, a content and loving man with a simple country wisdom and a deep devotion to Pip. He has no possessions. He considers that all the belongings of the house are his wife's, and no material ambitions. Joe and Pip are pals, and they share a special camaraderie and understanding, until Pip becomes obsessed with climbing the social ladder. Joe is Dickens' symbol of absolute goodness, and when Pip turns his back on him, he therefore turns his back on all that's valuable in life. Mrs. Joe, Pip's sister and Joe's wife. She's 20 years older than Pip, and she's a shrew. She whips and punishes Pip, although Joe tries as much as he can to neutralize her effect. Mrs. Joe likes to play the martyr, mentioning frequently how grateful Pip should be to her, and complaining about the work she does for her husband and brother. She's also a woman who's impressed by wealth and status, and takes advantage of any opportunity she can to further her position in life. Mr. Pumblechook, a character who possesses one of those classically comic names for which Dickens is known. Pumblechook is Joe's uncle. He's a well-to-do merchant who is pompous, self-righteous, and hypocritical. Mrs. Joe knocks herself out to please and impress him. Joe and Pip disdain him. Biddy. When Mrs. Joe becomes infirm, Biddy is taken on as housekeeper. She's a compassionate and honest young woman with the same simple goodness Joe has. Biddy despairs over Pip's wrong turn in life and confronts him with his betrayal of Joe. Eventually, Pip realizes Biddy's innate goodness and hopes to marry her. But by then, it's too late. Mrs. Joe has died, and Biddy has married Joe. Orlick, a worker hired by Joe to help in the forge. He's a brooding, hostile character who's jealous of Pip and takes his vengeance out on Mrs. Joe by assaulting her with an iron file. Mrs. Joe never recovers from the attack. She's left permanently impaired and eventually dies. Miss Havisham, a wealthy old lady who Pip believes to be his secret benefactor, although in fact she's not. Miss Havisham's world stopped many years ago when she was deserted on her wedding day. She's kept her house the same since then, as if awaiting the return of her would-be bridegroom. Her entire purpose in life is to gain revenge for the wrong done her. She's raised an adopted daughter, Estella, and hopes to vicariously avenge herself on men through her. Estella, Miss Havisham's adopted daughter and the instrument of her revenge. She's beautiful but haughty and cold, and delights in manipulating men, as she was trained to do by her adoptive mother. Estella is the source of Pip's desire to become a gentleman, and so she's a key character and motivating force for all that happens later. Herbert Pocket, a member of the Pocket family, a family related to Miss Havisham, most of whom are hypocrites who aspire after her money and only pretend to like her. Herbert is an exception. He's an honest and faithful friend to Pip, and Pip wants to help him succeed. The only decent use Pip makes of his money is to secretly buy Herbert a partnership in an accounting firm. Mr. Jaggers, a criminal lawyer who serves as Pip's guardian when the boy comes into a fortune. Jaggers knows the identity of Pip's benefactor, but must keep it a secret. Through the character of Jaggers, Dickens is able to write another of his condemnations of the criminal justice system. Jaggers is a success in his field, but he's a man lacking in scruples and honesty, an expert at manipulating people. Nevertheless, we come to see a few redeeming qualities and an occasional show of kindness. Molly, Mr. Jaggers' strange, wild housekeeper, over whom he seems to hold some special, mysterious force. It will turn out that Molly is Estella's real mother, and she gave the child up for adoption upon Jaggers' insistence when she was charged and tried for murder and threatened to kill the child. Mr. Wemmick, Jaggers' assistant in the law office. He becomes a special friend of Pip's. Wemmick's life is carefully divided into two compartments: his home, which is designed to resemble a castle and which reflects his warmth and imagination, and his office, where he takes on a completely different character, businesslike and wooden. He is Dickens' statement about the incompatibility of law and humanism. Abel Magwitch, a convict who plays a key role in the book. Magwitch is the true source of Pip's expectations, or endowment. Although he's crude and common, he's devoted to Pip, who once showed some kindness towards him. When Pip discovers Magwitch is the source of his inheritance, he's mortified. But his affection for the convict eventually comes to the surface, and he nurses him until his death. Let's see now how the relationships of these characters help to form the story that is known as Great Expectations. As the story begins, Pip tells us his full name is Philip Pirrip, and that he has no memory of his parents. One day he's sitting by his parents' tombstones in a churchyard near the marshes, when he's startled by a man who leaps from behind a tombstone and grabs him. The man is mud-soaked and seems fearful. He's also in shackles. The man threatens Pip with death if he doesn't return the next morning with food and a file, and Pip, frightened, agrees. The man releases Pip, but Pip turns to watch as he limps away across the marsh. Pip returns home to his sister's house. He describes his sister as tall and bony, with coarse red skin. Her husband, Joe, is blonde and blue-eyed, sweet-natured, and easygoing. Pip's sister, known as Mrs. Joe, returns home and whips Pip for being late. Later, when she serves dinner, Pip hides his serving of bread and butter to take to the convict. His conscience bothers him for stealing from Mrs. Joe, and he begins to worry that the convict may be outside even now, waiting for his meal. Later, Pip hears the great guns in the battery firing and asks why. He's told it means another convict has escaped from the hulks, the prison ships moored at the marshes. The next morning is Christmas, and Pip awakens filled with dread and fear that he now must rob Mrs. Joe's pantry. He takes cheese, meat, a pork pie, and some brandy, and, along with a file from Joe's forge, he sets off for the marshes. There, in a misty fog, Pip finds the convict asleep. He recognizes his now familiar gray suit and shackled leg. But when he wakes the man, the face is not the same. The new convict lashes out at Pip, and terror-stricken Pip runs away. Pip finds the first convict waiting at the battery, shivering in the cold. The convict hungrily gobbles down the food Pip has brought him, and Pip assures him that he's told no one of his whereabouts. When Pip tells him about the second convict who's escaped, the first one becomes furious and sets to work with the file to free himself of his shackles. Pip returns home and tells Mrs. Joe he was out listening to Christmas carols. She responds that she might have gone too if she weren't, in her words, a slave with her apron never off. Joe indicates with crossed fingers that his wife is in a bad mood, and Pip should keep his distance. That night there's a Christmas party at the house, and among the guests is Mr. Pumblechook, Joe's well-to-do uncle, who Pip is not allowed to call uncle. Pip is given the worst scraps of food, but Joe secretly spoons more gravy onto his plate. Pumblechook, as is his custom, lectures Pip about how grateful he should be for being taken in by his relatives. Mrs. Joe has just discovered the missing food that Pip stole, but before the terrified boy can be confronted, the party is interrupted by a group of soldiers carrying guns and handcuffs. Pip is sure the handcuffs are for him, but the soldiers are simply looking for the blacksmith, Joe, to repair the handcuffs. The soldiers say they have orders to catch a pair of escaped convicts, and Pip is overcome with pity for the convict he helped. Joe suggests that he and Pip join the soldiers, and Pip agrees. On their tramp across the marsh, Joe whispers to Pip that he hopes the soldiers don't find the men. They come across the two convicts, fighting ferociously at the bottom of a ditch. Pip's convict is in a rage. He tells the soldiers that the other imitated him by escaping, and that he's once again trying to profit at his expense. As the men are tied up, Pip signals to his convict that he didn't betray him. Pip's convict looks at him attentively, and later, when all are seated around a fire, he says he wishes to confess that he stole some food from the blacksmith's house. Told that Joe is the blacksmith, the convict apologizes to him. But Joe responds that though he doesn't know why the man is a convict, he certainly wouldn't want a poor miserable fellow creature starved for it. At this, the convict turns away, and Pip hears the click of a sob in his throat. The convicts are led back to the prison ship, and Joe and Pip return home. That night, when Pip's falling asleep, he feels guilty about not telling Joe the truth about the convict, but he's still afraid to make a clean breast of it. Pip is working as an apprentice in Joe's forge, but Mrs. Joe keeps his small earnings in a box in the kitchen that he's never allowed to see. Every evening, Pip goes for lessons from an elderly neighbor lady who owns a small general store. A small girl named Biddy, orphaned like Pip, helps in the store. It's Biddy who does most of the work with Pip's lessons, since the elderly lady tends to fall asleep a lot. One evening, when he's mastered the alphabet with Biddy's help, Pip writes a note to Joe, but when Joe sees it, he can only recognize his name. Those are the only letters he knows. In the conversation that follows, Joe says that when he proposed to Mrs. Joe, he insisted that Pip come along, and that the two of them are now ever the best of friends. Pip hugs Joe and cries. Mrs. Joe arrives with Uncle Pumblechook, and they announce they have great news. Miss Havisham, the wealthy old lady who lives at the end of town, wants Pip to come and play at her house. Both Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook are sure this is the beginning of Pip's fortune. The next day, Pip is at Miss Havisham's. She lives in a brick house with the windows boarded up or barred with iron. When Pip rings, a very pretty, proud young lady answers the door. It's Miss Havisham's adopted daughter, Estella. She calls Pip boy and treats him with scorn. Estella takes him to Miss Havisham's room and leaves. The room is dark, lit only by a few candles. Miss Havisham is seated, all in white, wearing a bridal veil, now yellowed with age, and flowers and jewels. She's surrounded by half-packed trunks. The bride has white hair, sunken eyes, and her figure is so withered that the dress no longer fits. All the clocks in the house are stopped at 20 minutes before 9. Miss Havisham tells Pip her heart is broken and she needs diversion, so she wants him to play cards with Estella. When Estella protests that Pip is only a laborer, Miss Havisham replies, "You can break his heart." The rest of the day Estella treats Pip with contempt and insults. When it's time to go home, Pip has been convinced of his own coarseness and ignorance, and wishes Joe would call Jacks knaves like Estella does. Later, when Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook pepper him with questions about his visit, Pip makes up an unremarkable story about Miss Havisham, thinking they won't believe the incredible truth. Pip feels badly when he sees that Joe, too, believes his fiction, so later he confesses to Joe. Pip also tells Joe that he feels common, but Joe denies that Pip is common and says, more to the point, that lies are not the way to get out of being common. Pip falls asleep thinking how common Estella would find Joe. The next day, when Joe and Pip visit a local tavern, a stranger sits nearby and makes sure that Pip sees him stirring his drink with the file Pip had taken to the convict. When Pip and Joe leave, the man slips Pip a coin wrapped in 2 one-pound notes. Joe, believing it to be a mistake, runs back to the tavern to return them, but the man is gone. Pip is disquieted by the incident. He thinks it's coarse and common to be on familiar terms with convicts. Pip has been invited to return to Miss Havisham's house weekly. On his next visit, he's led through a room of relatives who eye him suspiciously. Estella taunts Pip, slaps his face, and dares him to cry, but he holds his tears inside. On his way upstairs, Pip meets a burly, dark-skinned man who smells of scented soap. He looks at Pip carefully and proceeds on. Miss Havisham has Pip walk her round and round the dining room, where the remains of her wedding cake, now a pile of cobwebs, sit. She says it's her birthday, and the day she was to have been married. When Pip leaves, he's confronted by a pale young man who challenges him to a fight. Pip takes the challenge and begins pummeling the young man, who returns after every fall for more. Finally, he admits defeat. The boy seems so innocent and brave that Pip again feels like a savage. As a reward for winning the fight, Estella allows Pip to kiss her. For the next 10 months, Pip visits Miss Havisham weekly, often pushing her around in a wheelchair. He tells her of his plans to apprentice to Joe, but he also tells her his aspirations to rise higher. She seems uninterested in them. Every night, Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook talk about Pip's good prospects with Miss Havisham. One day, Miss Havisham asks Joe and Pip to visit her with the papers for Pip's apprenticeship. When they arrive, Pip is embarrassed by Joe's lack of refinement, particularly when he sees Estella laughing at Joe. But Miss Havisham seems to like Joe. She gives him a bag containing 25 guineas and tells Pip he now belongs to Joe. Pip returns home unhappy. Although he once liked Joe's trade, he feels he doesn't now and probably won't ever again. Pip becomes an apprentice to Joe, to the chagrin of Orlick, Joe's hired helper, who now fears Pip will replace him. Meanwhile, Pip sets out to teach Joe some of his lessons, to make him less ignorant. Joe is cooperative, but doesn't seem able to learn much. One day, Pip decides he wants to visit Miss Havisham's. He's been unable to get his mind off the beautiful Estella. When Joe gives him the day off, Orlick insists he get the day off too. Mrs. Joe complains that it would be a waste of wages, and Orlick responds by calling her a foul shrew. Joe manages to pacify everyone, and Pip heads out for Miss Havisham's. There, the old lady takes malicious glee in telling him that Estella is abroad, being educated as a lady. Then she tells Pip to visit her every year on his birthday. A downhearted Pip heads back home. When Pip arrives home, he finds that Mrs. Joe has been attacked in his absence, hit from behind on the head with a convict's leg iron that had been filed apart. Pip suspects two people, the man he saw in the tavern with the file, or else Orlick, who lives on the marsh and could easily have found the iron. He feels responsible for the incident because he supplied the weapon. Now Mrs. Joe's hearing, sight, speech, and memory are all impaired. Biddy moves in to take care of her and offer company to Joe. Time passes. Pip makes yearly visits to Miss Havisham's, where she gives him 1 guinea for his birthday and tells him Estella is still abroad. Biddy grows prettier, and her goodness makes an impression on Pip, although he reminds himself she's not as beautiful as Estella and is basically common. Nevertheless, he confides in Biddy his ambitions to be a gentleman someday, and his admiration of Estella. Biddy tells him Estella isn't worth his pain. When Orlick appears and follows Pip and Biddy, Biddy reveals to Pip her revulsion to Orlick, who seems to have taken a liking to her. One day a man approaches Pip and asks to speak to him. Pip recognizes him as the burly, dark-skinned fellow he once saw at Miss Havisham's. It turns out the man is Mr. Jaggers, a London attorney who was at Miss Havisham's because she's one of his clients. Now he tells Pip he's here as an agent of someone whose name must remain confidential, that Pip has, in his words, great expectations. By this expression, Mr. Jaggers means that Pip has come into property of a considerable sum, and that the donor would like Pip to be taken away and made into a gentleman. Jaggers will be his guardian, will dispense the money, and will see to his education. Pip is ecstatic and sure the money is coming from Miss Havisham. He even fancies that Miss Havisham is preparing him to be a suitable husband for Estella. The lawyer then offers Joe money as compensation for losing his apprentice. But Joe breaks down and says money could never compensate him for the loss of the child, who's his best friend. Later, Joe and Biddy both congratulate Pip, but there is sadness in their voices. The next day, Pip goes to the town tailor and has himself outfitted in a fine new suit. He tells everyone about his fortune. When Joe tells Pip he's sure they'll remain good friends, Pip is angry that Joe isn't grateful at the idea of him becoming a gentleman. Then Pip suggests to Biddy that she work to educate Joe, so that, as a gentleman, he'll be able to help him. Biddy is incensed, but Pip thinks she's just envious. Pumblechook has heard of Pip's good fortune, and is all flattery and amiability with the boy. Miss Havisham congratulates Pip in the manner of a fairy godmother, and takes pleasure in doing so in front of her jealous relatives. The next morning, when Pip is to head for his new life in London, he asks Joe not to walk with him to the village because he thinks Joe will look awkward next to him. He bids Joe and Biddy a brisk, short goodbye and heads out, fighting an impulse to run back and give them a more heartfelt farewell. His last view is of Joe and Biddy standing in front of the house, calling to him through their tears and throwing old shoes for good luck. In London, Pip goes to Jaggers' law office, where the attorney tells him he'll be staying with young Herbert Pocket, the son of Matthew Pocket, who will be Pip's tutor. The Pockets are relatives of Miss Havisham. Jaggers gives Pip a liberal allowance and remarks that, of course, Pip will go wrong somehow. When Pip meets Herbert Pocket, both young men burst into laughter. They recognize each other as the young opponent in a fist fight in Miss Havisham's courtyard. Herbert says Miss Havisham doesn't like him and that Estella, who Herbert doesn't like, was raised by Miss Havisham to take vengeance on the male sex. Over dinner, Herbert tells Pip Miss Havisham's whole story. She was a beautiful heiress with a half-brother who was irresponsible and extravagant. The brother always begrudged his sister because their father left the bulk of his inheritance to her. The brother ran himself steadily into debt. A very showy man, by no means a real gentleman, began to court Miss Havisham, and she fell in love with him. He weaseled money out of her, which he used to buy out her brother's share in the family brewery. A wedding was set, but on the day it was to occur, her suitor sent a letter backing out of it. He then shared the brother's profits. The two men fell into deeper degradation and finally financial ruin, and haven't been heard from since. Herbert and Pip become fast friends, and Herbert shares his ambitions for success with Pip, even though he's currently working at a menial job in a counting house. Pip secretly feels sure that Herbert will never be the gentleman that he, Pip, will be. The two become men about town, attending theaters and going out to dinner often. Pip feels the gulf between he and Joe and his old life is widening. Pip enjoys his tutor, Matthew Pocket, who is Herbert's father. Matthew is an outcast to Miss Havisham. She kicked him out of the family years ago when he tried to warn her about the evil intentions of her false suitor. But Matthew is a kind old soul, and under his tutelage, Pip does well. One day, Pip is invited to visit the home of Wemmick, Mr. Jaggers' assistant in the law office. When they arrive, Pip is surprised to see that Wemmick has whimsically designed his little cottage to look like a castle. He's done this in part to please his aging father, whom he cares tenderly for and will do anything to please. At home, Wemmick is completely different than at the office, livelier, warmer, and more imaginative, not the mechanical, stony man he is at work. He tells Pip he tries to keep his two lives separate. Pip is then invited to have dinner with Jaggers. When he arrives, Jaggers is briskly washing himself with scented soap. He does this every day after business, as if to free himself from the dirt and infamy of his trade. For Jaggers' specialty is representing the guilty, and more often than not, his clients are immoral and decadent. Pip is intrigued by Jaggers' housekeeper, a woman of about 40, thin and pale, with faded eyes and a wild mane of hair. She seems fierce, but at the same time, she seems fearful of Jaggers. Soon Pip receives a visit from Joe. Joe arrives glowing, but as the visit proceeds, he sees Pip's servant, his finely furnished room, and his restrained manner, he becomes more and more uncomfortable. He begins to call Pip Sir. Finally, he tells Pip he wouldn't have come but that Miss Havisham asked him to deliver a message, and it was a message Biddy refused to write. The message is, Estella is back and willing to see Pip. Joe then leaves, apologizing for his visit and saying he doesn't really fit in London. Pip returns to town to visit Estella and finds excuses for not staying with Joe. On the coach ride back, Pip is seated in front of two convicts who don't see him. He recognizes one as the man who gave him the money in the tavern, and overhears him telling the other about that very incident. Pip discovers that it was sent from the convict he'd helped with food and a file. At the Havisham home, Pip finds Estella more elegant and beautiful than ever, and just as proud. She tells Pip she has no heart and no sentiment. At one point, Miss Havisham throws her arm around Pip's neck and commands him vehemently to love Estella. Love her, she yells, love her. Pip has noticed that Orlick, Joe's assistant in the forge, is now working for Miss Havisham. Pip tells Jaggers, who is also Miss Havisham's lawyer, about Orlick's character and suggests he fire him. Jaggers agrees to do so. Back in London, Pip tells Herbert how his desire for Estella has only increased, and he's disconcerted when Herbert advises him to forget her. Then Herbert confides that he's in love too. Her name is Clara, but he can't yet afford to marry her. Pip silently resolves to help find Herbert a good job. Estella arrives in London, where she will be staying with a lady who's going to help introduce her to society. She tells Pip he may come and visit her, but whenever Pip does visit, she teases him and uses him to make her other suitors jealous. Meanwhile, Pip and Herbert are running themselves into debt with expensive dinners and extravagant evenings out. Pip just bundles up the bills and tucks them away. After some time, Pip hears that Mrs. Joe has died, and he's requested to come home for the funeral. He does go home, but his new manners make everyone so uncomfortable that Biddy suggests he not visit again. Pip agrees it's a good idea. With the help of Wemmick, Pip secretly procures his friend Herbert a position in a new firm. Herbert is so ecstatic when the offer comes that Pip cries in private over the good his expectations are doing. Pip is now 23. He's made no progress with the haughty Estella, is still going in debt, and has no occupation, although he reads a great deal. One night he hears footsteps on the stairs, and a man's voice calls out for Mr. Pip. Pip sees a man of about 60 with iron-gray hair and a weathered face. He's astounded when he recognizes the convict he rescued in the marshes so many years ago. But he's more astounded by the news that follows. The convict has made a fortune in Australia, and it's he who is Pip's benefactor. Pip is appalled that his money is coming from such a lowly source. He's even more appalled by the man's gratitude and affection. Although it was terribly unsafe for him to venture back to England, he just had to see his boy. Pip is horrified, for he knows that now he's bound to protect this man. He also knows that his belief that Miss Havisham was his benefactress has been stupid and vain. She had pretended to be so only to annoy her relatives. All hope of winning Estella is gone, and now he can never be a true gentleman, for his money has come from a criminal source. He fixes a bed for the convict and goes to bed himself in total disgrace. The next day, Pip decides to pass the convict off as his uncle. That morning, he notices a figure crouching in the stairway, but it quickly disappears before he can identify it. Pip discovers the convict's name is Abel Magwitch, but that he's going by the name Provis. He introduces Provis to Herbert and tells him the true story. They agree they'll have to come up with a plan for getting Provis out of the country. Later, Provis tells Pip his life story, and Pip discovers that the second convict on the marsh that night was named Compeyson, and that for many years Provis did his dirty work while Compeyson went free. Provis swore revenge on Compeyson, and now that convict lives in deadly fear of him. It's revealed that Compeyson was also the man who swindled Miss Havisham out of her money by a false promise of marriage. Pip visits Miss Havisham and confronts her, saying she let him believe she was his benefactress. She cries out that he set his own trap. Then he proceeds to tell her she's wronged Matthew Pocket, his tutor and Herbert's father, by ostracizing him from the family. He says the Pockets are good people, and then he asks her to pay for Herbert's partnership in his new firm. He, Pip, can no longer take money from his benefactor. He then tells both Miss Havisham and Estella of his love for Estella, and accuses them of cruelty in teasing him with that love. There is pain in his voice, and Miss Havisham's face reflects pity and remorse. Estella says she can never feel love because she wasn't taught to, and besides, she's planning to marry someone else. Pip and Herbert take Provis to the house of Herbert's girlfriend, Clara. It's located on the river, and they'll leave him there until Pip can get him onto a steamer and whisk him out of the country. At a dinner at Jager's house, Pip suddenly notices that the wild housekeeper reminds him of Estella, and he asks Jagers if she's her mother. Jagers admits it is. He once defended the woman against murder and took her child to Miss Havisham for adoption. Now Pip knows that Estella's beginnings were even more ignoble than his own, but he vows never to reveal his secret. Miss Havisham calls Pip to her house and gives him the money for Herbert's partnership. She's changed and begs Pip for her forgiveness. He offers it and prepares to depart. As he leaves, a spark from the fireplace ignites Miss Havisham's dress, and she's engulfed in flames. Pip puts the flames out, but Miss Havisham is badly injured. Pip, too, suffers a burned arm, and Herbert tends to him. He tells Pip that Provis is becoming gentler and softer, and has confided in Herbert a part of his early life when he was in love with a wild, jealous woman who Jaggers defended against murder. They had a child who vanished, whom Provis often thinks about. Pip now knows that Provis is Estella's father. Pip receives an anonymous letter asking him to visit the sluice house for information on Provis. But when he arrives, he's attacked by Orlick, and his life is only saved by the intervention of Herbert, who has found the note in Pip's room. It's time for Pip to help Provis escape England. He and Herbert row the old man out onto the river to catch a passing steamer. But they're stopped by customs officials, who are accompanied by Compeyson. Compeyson's been following Provis and now seeks to destroy his former partner. In the ensuing chaos, Provis and Compeyson fall into the river, fighting. Compeyson drowns, but Provis is pulled up with an injured head and chest. He's taken to prison, and later there's a trial, where he's condemned to death. While he awaits execution in prison, Pip nurses the old man and prays he'll die before he can be hung. Now Provis is Magwitch again. There's no need for an alias anymore. As the man grows weaker and weaker, Pip feels more and more affection for him. He vows to stay with the convict until the end. Meanwhile, Herbert has been transferred to a new office in Cairo. As he bids a sad farewell to Pip, he offers him a post in the new branch. Pip agrees to consider it. Magwitch dies with Pip by his side. But before he fades away, Pip tells him of his daughter, now a beautiful young woman whom Pip loves. Now Pip is totally alone. He suffers a fever and is almost delirious. He sees two strange men who have come to arrest him for his debts. He imagines he sees Joe by his side and calls his name. There's the answer of a familiar voice. When Pip recovers, he finds that Joe has indeed nursed him through his fever, and he's paid off Pip's debts. Pip begs him for forgiveness, but a happy Joe only responds, "Ever friends." Pip soon learns that Miss Havisham has died, leaving her fortune to Estella. Estella has married, and the man treats her cruelly. Pip returns home to ask Biddy to marry him, but when he hears that she has just married Joe, he feels only joy for the two people he loves. Pip goes to Cairo and joins Herbert in his firm. They both prosper, and 11 years later Pip returns home. He finds Joe and Biddy now have a little boy named Pip. Later he encounters Estella. Her husband has died, but she's changed much from the suffering, and says Pip has always been in her heart. As they walk, Pip takes Estella's hand, and he can imagine no shadow of another parting from her. With this reunion of two proud people who've been dramatically changed by the suffering in life, Great Expectations comes to its close. Pip's progression from innocence through his desires for social advancement to his rediscovery of what really matters in life, honesty, love, and devotion, is a saga that reflects the conflicts and experiences of many people. Readers can easily identify with the attraction to material attainment and social acceptance, particularly since Pip himself was an orphan and started life as a social outcast. Yet Dickens' point of view in the book is clear. To the author, property, wealth, and social standing all threaten and interfere with humanism. Property in this story is used for all the wrong reasons. Miss Havisham uses it to manipulate her family and as an instrument of revenge. Mrs. Joe grasps at it selfishly. Pumblechook likes to impress people with it. Magwitch uses it to vicariously fulfill his own wants. Jaggers uses it for power and influence, and will sacrifice any principle to attain it. And Pip desires it so he can feel better than others. The only characters in the story who are completely good are Joe and Biddy, who have neither property nor social status. And the only thing Pip ever does with his property that's worthwhile is to help his friend Herbert obtain a partnership. Great Expectations is a story of the potential of money and pride to corrupt, and it suggests a theory common to many Dickens novels, that a modest and simple life is the only way for man to maintain his integrity. Only when Pip takes up serious work as a clerk in Herbert's firm, and makes his own living rather than being handed a living, and only when he returns to the uneducated but wise truths by which Joe lives, is he redeemed. Estella, too, must know suffering and humiliation before she can find her heart and learn to love. Dickens' novel supports the theory that no man owns his wealth. Rather, his wealth owns him. Because in the pursuit of property, almost all the characters find themselves changed for the worst, behaving in ways that haunt their conscience and torment them with guilt. Jaggers must wash his hands constantly to purge himself of his own deeds. Pip, who is at first guilty and then remorseful about his behavior, finally abandons remorse altogether. It's the only way he can proceed in his life of falsity. And Wemmick must design for himself two completely separate lives, to protect the compassion and imagination that has no recourse in the world of business. All of them are as bound as the convict who struggled in his shackles along the marshes. It seems these shackles can only be broken by human pain and suffering, for not until Pip's own pride and hopes have been destroyed is he able to think of others. In the last chapters, his entire thoughts are for Herbert, Magwitch, Joe, and Biddy. With his great expectations gone, they can now be replaced by human values and love.
This is the end of the session.